Imagine a country where the women are just, well, fundamentally outperforming the men.
Right, across almost every vital metric.
Exactly, every metric of human development. We are talking about a society where a young woman entering the school system today is expected to stay in the classroom for nearly an entire year longer than her male counterpart.
Which is huge.
It is, and the universities are just brimming with highly educated female talent, where the women outlive the men by, get this, a staggering 8 years.
Yeah, an 8-year gap is, I mean, it's massive.
And where, over the last few decades, women have just surged into the political sphere, multiplying their presence in parliament by nearly 6 times.
Seizing over a third of all legislative seats, yeah.
Over a third. So it sounds like the ultimate progressive utopia, right?
It really does. I mean,
Yeah.
by every classical law of human capital and, economic theory.
A demographic that holds that much education and that much longevity and that much political influence.
They should be absolutely dominating the economy.
Exactly. If I'm an alien looking at those raw inputs, I'm assuming these women are running the corporate boards, right?
Launching the startups, taking home the lion's share of the national wealth.
Because that is the promise of modern development. You invest in your brain, you invest in your health, and the free market rewards you with capital.
That's the theory, anyway.
Right. But here's the paradox. Here is the massive, glaring contradiction we are going to explore with you today on this deep dive.
It's a fascinating one.
Despite building this world-class engine of female human capital, when you look at the actual bank accounts, these women are earning barely 67 cents for every dollar a man makes.
It is a phenomenal structural fracture. What we are looking at is a phenomenon that the researchers behind today's slide deck call a folded truth.
A folded truth. I love that term.
Yeah, it's a situation where the trajectory of human development shoots straight up, hits this invisible barrier, and completely folds back in on itself.
Before it can ever convert into actual economic wealth.
Exactly.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we have this incredible, custom-designed 15-page slide deck. It's essentially an academic breakdown of decades of longitudinal data.
Tracking everything from 1990 all the way to 2023.
Right, and we're using this to unpack this exact paradox. And the country we are looking at, well, it isn't a Scandinavian social democracy.
No, it's not.
It isn't some Western economic superpower. The country that has quietly engineered this incredible yet deeply flawed human development machine is Armenia.
Which is what makes this such a compelling case study, for anyone interested in economics or global development.
Because we have this incredibly rare opportunity to track a nation's entire post-Soviet transition.
We aren't just looking at a static snapshot of today. We were looking at a 33-year timeline.
It captures the initial economic shocks of the 1990s, the slow recovery, and then this relentless, steady ascent into the 2020s.
And what an ascent it is. I mean, slide 2 of our deck really paints the picture.
Yeah, before we get into the gender paradox, before we start asking why the women are hitting this invisible wall, we really need to understand the bedrock of the society we are talking about.
Right, what kind of playing field these people are standing on.
So let's start with the macro picture. Let's talk about the Human Development Index, the HDI.
The HDI is essentially the gold standard for measuring a country's overall well-being.
Right.
It was created because economists realized that just measuring GDP, gross domestic product, was incredibly reductive.
Because GDP tells you how much money a country is moving, but
it doesn't tell you if the people are actually living good lives.
Exactly. So the HDI looks at 3 core pillars: a long and healthy life, access to knowledge, and a decent standard of living.
The visual in the slide deck uses the heart, the book, and the coin.
I like that. The heart, the book, and the coin. And if we trace Armenia's HDI trajectory on that deep gray line on the chart from 1990 to 2023, it is a story of just profound resilience.
Truly. In 1990, right on the precipice of massive geopolitical and economic upheaval, their HDI sat at 0.663.
Which is a pretty modest number.
Yeah, very modest. But by 2023, that number had climbed all the way to 0.811.
And just to give you some context on what a 0.8111 actually means on the global stage, it places Armenia comfortably in the high human development tier.
Out of 193 countries tracked globally, they are ranked 71st.
They have built a genuinely robust infrastructure for human flourishing. You don't get to a 0.811 by accident.
No, you definitely don't. You get there by persistently investing in hospitals and schools, in roads.
The basic machinery of a modern state.
It takes decades of compounding structural investment. But, as powerful as the HDI is, it has a significant blind spot.
Right.
It is an average. And an average can hide a multitude of sins.
Oh, absolutely. You can easily have a country that boasts a high HDI because the top 20% of the population is like exceedingly wealthy, highly educated, and living to be 90.
While the bottom 20% is living in absolute destitution.
Right. If Jeff Bezos walks into a local dive bar, the average net worth of everyone in that room suddenly jumps to, what, $5 billion?
Exactly. But that doesn't mean the guy sitting in the corner drinking a beer is suddenly rich.
The average is a mathematical illusion.
So, to ensure we aren't being fooled by an average, the slide deck pivots to slide 12, a completely different metric to check the floor of the society.
The Multidimensional Poverty Index, or the MPI.
Right, and this is where the data gets genuinely astonishing.
The MPI is the metric that strips away the averages and looks at the absolute harshest realities of human existence. It doesn't just look at income.
It asks questions about severe deprivation.
Do you have a dirt floor? Do you lack access to clean drinking water? Is there basic sanitation? Are your children malnourished?
It measures the people who are falling through the cracks of the modern world. And in 2016, Armenia's Multidimensional Poverty Index was recorded at 0.001.
0.000. That translates to a poverty headcount rate of just 0.2%.
It is effectively zero.
Which means they have essentially eliminated severe, absolute multidimensional poverty.
In the global ranking specifically dealing with multidimensional poverty elimination, they sit right at the #1 position.
Wow. They have built a social safety net that is so resilient, so encompassing, that it guarantees basic survival and dignity for almost every single citizen.
I want you to think about this in terms of building a house.
Okay, I like a good house analogy.
If you are constructing a society from the ground up, the MPI, that 0.001 score, that's your foundation.
A flawless, impenetrable concrete slab.
Right. Nobody's falling through the floorboards into the dirt. And the Human Development Index, that 0.811 score, is the sturdy 3-story structural frame built on top of that foundation.
They have the plumbing for health, the wiring for education, the insulation for a decent living standard.
It is a beautifully constructed macro structure. The foundation is secure, and the walls are strong.
But, and this is the crux of this entire deep dive, who actually gets to live in the penthouse of this beautiful house?
Yeah, who gets to enjoy the best views and the most wealth?
Because human development is not experienced as a macro average. It is experienced by individuals. And the most fundamental fault line we can examine in any society is the split between men and women.
Which brings us back to slide 3, the Gender Development Index, the GDI.
This is where the story of Armenia transitions from a standard development success story into a profound global anomaly.
Let's define the GDI for you so we are all on the same page.
Yeah, please do.
The GDI takes that overall Human Development Index we just talked about, and it splits it in half. It calculates the HDI for women, and it calculates the HDI for men, and then it compares them.
So if the GDI is exactly 1.0, you have perfect gender parity.
Exactly. If it is below 1.0, it means men have a higher overall development index. And if it is above 1.0, it means women are, on average, achieving higher development metrics than men.
And we really need to emphasize how rare it is to consistently score above 1.0.
The vast majority of the world, including incredibly wealthy, progressive nations, sits below that parity line.
Because historically, human development has been a very male-dominated arena.
But if we look at the raw data for Armenia, they have essentially lived above that parity line since the mid-1990s.
The timeline is wild. Even in 1995, just a few years after independence, when the country was going through massive post-Soviet economic restructuring,
Their GDI was already at a 0.981.
it dipped briefly around the year 2000, down to 0.942, but then it began this relentless, unstoppable climb.
By 2018, it hit 0.997. And then, in 2020, it spiked to a world-leading 1.032.
Ranking them second globally out of 193 countries for that year, second in the world.
And in the most recent 2023 data, it sits firmly at 1.006, keeping them in the global top 25.
The aggregate data is speaking unequivocally here. Women in the society have slightly but decisively surpassed men in the core metrics of human development.
Okay, so the immediate question you have to ask is,
How? What are the specific engines driving this female dominance in the data?
right, if human development is a 3-pillar system, the book, the heart, and the coin, where exactly are the women pulling ahead?
Let's look at the book first. Slide 4. Let's talk about education.
The researchers use a metric called expected years of schooling. This is a forward-looking estimate.
It asks, based on current enrollment rates, how many total years of education can a child entering the school system today expect to receive over their lifetime?
In 2023, the data shows that for an Armenian male, that expectation is 13.91 years.
Now, That is a perfectly respectable number. It gets you through primary school, secondary school, and gives you a taste of post-secondary or vocational training.
But for an Armenian female, the expectation jumps to 14.88 years.
That is nearly 15 full years of formal education. Women are spending nearly a full extra year in the educational system compared to men,
And this isn't just a projection for the future. If we look backward at the mean years of schooling,
which measures the actual years achieved by adults aged 25 and older currently living in the country.
right, women still age out men, 11.35 years to 11.34 years.
And what I find so fascinating about this is the historical trend line. If you dig into the data from the 1990s, men actually had a higher expectation of schooling in the past.
Yes, back in 1995, actual attainment favored men, even if expectation was slightly tilted.
But over the next 2 decades, female educational attainment didn't just catch up, it accelerated at a blistering pace.
They achieved a clear, sustained dominance in the classroom.
The implication here is profound. It means that the pipeline of highly educated human capital in the country, the people with the advanced degrees, the deep technical knowledge, the specialized skills,
Is disproportionately female. The intellectual engine of the nation is being driven by women.
Okay, so they have completely conquered the book pillar. What about the heart? What about health, longevity, and survival? That's slide 5.
This is where the gap isn't just a statistical edge. It is a massive biological and sociological gulf.
We are looking at life expectancy at birth.
In 1990, female life expectancy was 71.46 years. Male life expectancy was 63.82 years,
So right out of the gate, 30 years ago, there was already a 7.5-year gap.
which is common, right? Women generally live slightly longer than men globally due to a mix of biological factors and risk behaviors.
But look at what happens when we fast forward to 2023.
Female life expectancy grows beautifully. It climbs steadily over 3 decades to reach 79.45 years.
They are knocking on the door of an 80-year average lifespan.
But male life expectancy, it grew at a much slower, much more volatile pace, only reaching 71.38 years by 2023.
That results in an 8-year survival advantage for women, 8 full years.
That is nearly a decade of extra life.
And the data shows there were moments where this gap was even more tragic. In 2020, likely due to a brutal combination of the global pandemic and regional conflicts, male life expectancy briefly plummeted to 61.9 years.
While female life expectancy fell to 76.3, that was an unthinkable 14-year gap in a single year.
While that 2020 plunge was an anomaly driven by crisis, the overarching macro trend is undeniable and stable. Women in this country live significantly longer, and they are significantly more educated.
Okay, let's pause here, because this is where the cognitive dissonance kicks in.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here. I want to look at this strictly through the lens of cold, hard, free market economics.
Let's do it.
In classic economic theory, human capital is the ultimate input. Your health, your longevity, your education, these are the assets you bring to the labor market.
The market is supposed to be a rational pricing mechanism. It looks at your assets and rewards you with an output, income.
So if I'm looking at a demographic that holds all the human capital, if women are spending 15 years in school getting advanced degrees and they're living to be almost 80 years old.
We have more time to build careers, more time to accrue compound interest, more time to reach executive levels.
Logically, these women must be out-earning the men by a landslide, right?
It is the most logical assumption you can make based on classical theory. If the inputs are higher, the outputs must be higher.
Right. If I have a master's degree and 15 years of healthy career runway ahead of me, companies should be fighting to hire me.
But this perfectly sets up the dramatic reveal on slide 6. This is where the classical economic logic completely shatters, and we hit the folded truth.
Let's look at the third pillar, the coin, gross national income, or GNI, per capita.
In 2023, the gross national income per capita for men, adjusted for purchasing power parity, so we're looking at real localized value, was $24,444.
A very solid figure. It represents a dynamic, growing economy.
And for women, the demographic with the extra year of schooling, the demographic living 8 years longer.
Yeah, what's their number?
Their GNI per capita in 2023 was only $16,565.
It is an absolute cliff. Women are earning barely 67.7% of what men earn.
Despite holding the dominant cards in health and education, they are making little more than 2/3 of the male income.
How is that even possible?
To understand how it's possible, we have to look at the history of this income cliff, because it's actually stubbornly persistent.
Really?
Yeah, back in 1995, women earned $2,739, while men earned $4,457. In 2005, it was $5,463 for women against $13,074 for men.
Wow, meaning women were making less than half back then.
So the 67.7% ratio in 2023 is technically an improvement in terms of the percentage gap, but the absolute dollar gap has only widened as the economy grew.
Let me push back on this because my brain is struggling to reconcile the inefficiency here.
Sure.
If there's a massive pool of highly educated female talent, and they are currently only being paid 67 cents on the dollar, why wouldn't a rational corporation, or a multinational firm moving into the region just exclusively hire women?
It makes sense on paper.
Right. They could get superior talent at a 30% discount. The free market should theoretically arbitrage this wage gap out of existence. Why is the market failing to price this labor correctly?
Because the market does not exist in a vacuum.
Yeah.
It exists within a cultural and structural ecosystem. And to see where the system is breaking down, we turn to slide 7.
Ah, the leaky pipeline.
Exactly. We have to look at a metric called the labor force participation rate, or LFPR. This measures the percentage of the adult population, aged 15 and older, who are either actively working or actively looking for work.
Essentially, who is actually showing up to the formal economy to play the game?
Right. In 2023, the male labor force participation rate was 76.78%. More than 3/4 of adult men are actively engaged in the workforce.
And the female labor force participation rate?
It was only 61.61%.
There it is, a roughly 15 percentage point gap.
This is what economists call the leaky pipeline.
The state is investing heavily in female education. Families are spending years supporting their daughters through nearly 15 years of schooling.
These women are graduating university with high skills, brilliant minds, and excellent health.
But then they vanish. A massive chunk of them never enter the formal labor market.
So the human capital line is shooting straight up, but right as it's about to cross over into wealth generation, it hits a wall and just folds back on itself.
That's the folded truth right there.
Precisely. The data forces us to ask, what invisible forces are keeping a highly educated demographic out of the workforce?
The numbers in the spreadsheets don't explicitly spell out the word culture, but they imply it heavily.
We are looking at traditional gender roles, where the expectation to manage the household, raise children, and care for aging parents falls disproportionately or entirely on women.
We are looking at a lack of socialized caregiving infrastructure. If there are no affordable daycares or elder care facilities, well, someone has to do that work.
And society defaults to the women, essentially forcing them to provide that labor for free at home rather than selling their highly educated labor in the formal market.
And even for the 61% of women who do enter the workforce, that massive income gap tells us they are hitting a glass ceiling.
They're either being culturally sorted into lower-paying sectors like primary education or care work,
Or they're being actively blocked from high-level, high-income executive and technical roles despite having the credentials.
is a systemic misallocation of resources.
I keep thinking about this like engineering a high-end smartphone.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine a tech company spends billions of dollars developing the most powerful battery and the most advanced processor in the world. That represents the health and education of Armenia's women.
Right. The hardware is absolutely flawless. It beats the competition hands down.
But then, right before they ship the phone to the public, they throttle the software so the operating system can only run at 60% capacity.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it. You have a supercar engine, but you've installed a governor that won't let it go over 40 miles an hour.
It's not just unfair to the phone, it's a massive, tragic waste of engineering.
It really is.
Leaving that much highly educated human capital on the sidelines isn't just a social justice issue for women. It is an objective economic loss for the entire country.
Think of the GDP growth, the tax revenue, the innovation they are just leaving on the table because they won't let the processor run at 100%.
It is an immense inefficiency.
And for a developing economy transitioning into a modernized state, you simply cannot afford to leave your best educated workers on the bench.
You need every ounce of human capital firing on all cylinders to escape the middle income trap.
Exactly. Okay, so the diagnosis is crystal clear. The pipeline is leaky, the software is throttled, the cultural forces are overriding the free market.
The obvious next question for anyone listening is the country actually doing anything to fix this? Are there systemic repairs underway, or are they just accepting this inefficiency?
To answer that, the data on slide 8 requires us to shift our focus.
We have to look away from the bank accounts and the labor force statistics.
But we need to look at the ballot boxes in the hospitals.
Because while the economic sphere is lagging, the political and physiological spheres are undergoing a revolution.
This brings us to the systemic repairs. And the researchers introduce a new metric here to track this, the Gender Inequality Index, or the GII.
Now, we've thrown a lot of acronyms at you today, HDI, MPI, GDI. So let's make sure we clearly define what makes the GII different.
It is a crucial distinction. The Gender Development Index, the GDI, which Armenia ranked number 2 globally in, measures achievement.
It says, look how high women can climb in health and education relative to men.
But the Gender Inequality Index, the GII, measures loss.
Loss of achievement.
Right. It calculates the penalty a country pays in potential human development due to inequality between female and male achievements.
It looks specifically at reproductive health, empowerment, and the labor market.
So for the GII, you don't want a high number. You want your inequality loss to be 0.
And the data shows a plunge in this inequality index that is really quite dramatic.
In 1995, their GII was 0.468. That represents a massive loss of potential.
But fast forward to 2023, and it has plummeted to a remarkable 0.180.
That is a 61.5% drop in macro inequality.
Globally, they now rank 50th on this metric. So they are actively shrinking the macro inequality gap at an incredible speed.
The question is, how are they doing it if the income gap is still so bad?
Slide 9 gives us the answer. They are doing it through aggressive structural political empowerment. Let's look at the data on national parliament seats.
Let me walk you through the timeline of female political representation, because it is wild.
Back in 1990, the national parliament was almost entirely a boys' club. Women held a microscopic 6.3% of the legislative seats.
And for decades, that number basically flatlined. In 2000, it actually dropped to 3%. In 2006, it was 5.3%.
It was a completely male-dominated room writing the laws of the nation.
But then the data shows a massive inflection point.
Right around 2017, the numbers just explode. In 2017, female representation jumps to 18%. In 2019, it hits 23.4%.
And by 2023, it has surged to 35.5%.
That is nearly a 6-fold increase from the 1990 baseline. More than a third of the lawmakers writing the future of the country are now women.
And this touches on an incredibly important concept in political science and sociology, the theory of critical mass.
Tell us about that.
When a minority group in a legislative body is sitting at 3% or 5%, they are effectively tokens.
They can raise issues, but they don't have the voting power to force legislative change.
But when that group crosses the 30% threshold, the entire dynamic of the room changes.
They transition into a critical mass capable of shifting the core legislative agenda.
Because at 35.5%, you can't form a coalition without them. You can't pass a budget without appeasing their interests.
Exactly. And when women reach critical mass in parliament, global data shows that the types of laws being debated fundamentally shift.
You see a massive increase in legislation regarding family policy, maternal health care, domestic violence protections, and educational access.
And I want to be very careful here. Political discussions can get incredibly charged. And whether you lean left, right, or center on the political spectrum, our goal here is simply to look at the objective mechanics of the data.
We're just reporting what the source material shows.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the objective data shows an undeniable, powerful correlation. As women gained a critical mass of voices in lawmaking, the national health metrics specifically pertaining to women's bodies vastly improved.
We can see the direct, life-saving results of that political shift on slide 10. The researchers refer to this as the reproductive shield.
There are 2 critical indicators here that track a woman's physical autonomy and safety: maternal mortality and adolescent birth rates.
Let's talk about maternal mortality first. This is the tragedy of women dying from pregnancy-related causes.
Let's really think about what this number means. In 1994, the maternal mortality rate was 59.16 deaths per 100,000 live births.
That means the fundamental act of starting a family, of continuing the society, carried a very real, very terrifying shadow of death.
It creates an underlying anxiety in the culture regarding childbirth.
But look at 2023. That number dropped to 27.1 times.
They essentially cut the risk of dying in childbirth in half.
That is not just a statistical win. That is thousands of mothers surviving to raise their children.
And that requires massive investments in rural clinics, surgical training, and prenatal care.
It is a phenomenal public health victory. But the second metric in this reproductive shield is perhaps even more structurally transformative for the entire timeline of a woman's life.
We need to look at the adolescent birth rate, meaning births per 1,000 women ages 15 to 19.
Engaged pregnancies.
Yes. In 1992, that rate was exceptionally high, at roughly 87.8.
Let me do the math on that. That means nearly 9% of all teenage girls in the country were having children before they turned 20.
Exactly. Now follow that data line down to 2023. It plummets to 13.44.
Wow. From almost 88 down to 13. That is a societal paradigm shift.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this is the missing puzzle piece that explains the very first paradox we discussed.
Remember that 14.88 expected years of schooling for women. Remember the female dominance in the universities.
Yes, the massive drop in teen pregnancies is exactly why female education rates have climbed to nearly 15 years.
Oh, I see it. It's causality.
Exactly. When 9% of your teenage girls are becoming mothers, they are dropping out of high school. They are certainly not going to university.
Their human capital development is abruptly halted by maternal responsibilities.
But when you drop that rate down to 13, you give an entire generation of young women their bodily autonomy back.
You give them the time required to finish high school, apply for scholarships, and attend university. The reproductive shield protects the human capital engine.
It's a stunning cascade of positive human development. The political power, getting to 35.5% in parliament, directs funding to build the reproductive shield.
The reproductive shield, having maternal mortality and crashing teen pregnancy, allows for the massive boom in education.
The education leads to the health awareness and longevity. It all feeds back into itself.
It is a virtuous cycle of development.
But, and there's always a but in these deep dives.
Right, we can't ignore the elephant in the room.
We are still left with that glaring, stubborn income gap. Gender inequality is shrinking politically. It is shrinking medically.
But what about society as a whole? Are the benefits of this massive development evenly distributed?
And frankly, what is the ultimate price tag of this rapid development? Because nothing in economics is free.
That is the darker side of the data on slide 11, and it brings us to a crucial pivot in our analysis: the invisible costs.
Development is never free. It has systemic costs, both social and ecological.
To understand this, the researchers introduced two final adjustments to that original 0.811 Human Development Index score we started with.
We are getting into the really heavy analytics now. We're going to apply some taxes to that score. First, the data introduces the IHDI, or the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index.
Remember our dive bar analogy. The HDI assumes development is distributed relatively evenly.
The IHDI comes in and says, let's penalize the score based on how unequal the society actually is across the board.
Not just by gender, but rich versus poor, urban versus rural, capital city versus farming village.
And when you apply that penalty, that tall, confident 0.811 score shrinks. The IHDI for 2023 is only 0.743.
Looking at the raw data, Armenia suffers an 8.35% loss in human development, simply due to systemic inequality.
And when you drill down into the specific components of that loss, it reinforces everything we've discovered so far.
Inequality in education and life expectancy are relatively low. The society is providing schools and hospitals fairly equitably.
But the inequality in income is massive, hovering around a 15% loss.
So the wealth is being hoarded, the resources are there, the people are educated, but the capital is bottlenecked at the top.
I think of it like looking at your pay stub.
Okay, yeah.
The original HDI is your gross paycheck. It looks fantastic. You feel great about it.
But the IHDI takes out the inequality tax.
And suddenly your net take-home development isn't quite as high.
That is a very apt way to look at it. And unfortunately for that paycheck, slide 13 shows there is a second tax that has to be deducted.
A tax that every rapidly developing nation on Earth is currently wrestling with. We have to look at the planetary pressure.
Right, because building a modern, highly educated, long-living society requires an immense amount of physical energy.
You can't run modern hospitals, universities, and high-speed internet without burning something. You need concrete, steel, electricity, and transportation.
And historically, the only way humanity has ever figured out how to move a country from a low HDI to a high HDI is by burning massive amounts of carbon and extracting millions of tons of raw materials from the Earth.
To measure this environmental toll, the UN developed the PHDI, the Planetary Pressures Adjusted HDI.
Let's trace the data on their carbon emissions and material footprint, because the shape of this curve is a bit ominous.
In the early 90s, right after the collapse of the Soviet industrial base, Armenia went through a period of severe energy scarcity.
Their carbon emissions plummeted out of necessity. In 1993, they were producing just 0.726 tons of CO2 per capita. Their material footprint was around 2.93 tons.
But as the economy recovered, as the foundation was poured and the human development soared, so did the environmental impact.
By 2023, carbon emissions per capita had grown to 2.739 tons.
That is nearly a four-fold increase from the 1993 low.
And their material footprint rocketed to 7.96 tons per person.
So people are consuming more, building more, driving more. And when the researchers apply the PHDI adjustment to account for this environmental toll, the HDI takes another painful hit.
It drops down to 0.761, which is a 6.16% tax or loss due to planetary pressures.
What is so fascinating and frankly so difficult about this data is that this is the classic, unavoidable growing pain of development economics.
Armenia is experiencing exactly what Western nations experienced in the 20th century.
They're trying to build a modernized, comfortable state for their citizens, but they are doing it using a 20th century carbon-heavy playbook.
It's like taking out a high-interest payday loan to build a business.
Yes, the cash infusion allows you to build the storefront, hire the employees, and get the business running. That's the HDI going up.
But the loan is accruing massive interest in the background. That's the carbon emissions and the ecological damage.
Eventually, the bill comes due, and the environmental debt could bankrupt the very society you just built.
A perfect analogy. You are borrowing against the future to develop the present.
So when you apply the inequality tax and the environmental tax, you are left with a very sober, realistic picture.
You have a country that has achieved miraculous things in human capital, but is currently carrying a massive amount of structural and ecological debt.
Which leaves us at a profound crossroads. Slides 14 and 15 wrap this all up. We have all the puzzle pieces on the table now.
We have a nation with brilliant, world-class female human capital.
We have a stubborn economic glass ceiling that prevents that capital from generating wealth.
We have a rising tide of female political power and physical autonomy.
And we have a rapidly growing environmental bill. How does this story end? How does a country navigate this?
This is where the researchers synthesize the data and offer a roadmap. The data places Armenia firmly at a developmental intersection.
On one side, they possess the human capital of a fully developed, top-tier nation.
On the other side, they face the structural economic inequalities and the ecological hurdles of a developing nation.
They are effectively living in two different economic eras simultaneously.
To reconcile this, the slide deck suggests three core macro-level changes.
And what I want you, the listener, to keep in mind is that these aren't just nice-to-have progressive social ideals.
In the context of global economics, these are hard, cold economic necessities for survival.
Let's walk through them. Number one, break the glass ceiling. The recommendation is to formulate aggressive policies to shrink that 32% wage gap.
From a purely capitalist perspective, if the state is paying to educate a woman for 15 years, and she's only earning 67% of what a man with 14 years of education earns, the market is failing.
Breaking the glass ceiling means ensuring that higher education actually translates into high-income roles, which drives up overall national GDP, increases tax revenue, and makes the whole country wealthier.
It's fixing the throttled software on the smartphone so the processor can run at 100%.
Exactly. Recommendation number two, balance home and work. This directly addresses that 15% gap in labor force participation.
The roadmap calls for building a socialized care system for children and the elderly.
Because right now, the women are doing it for free.
Yes. If nearly 40% of your adult women are outside the formal labor market, many of them are trapped performing invisible, unpaid care labor.
By socializing that care, by building affordable daycares, state-subsidized elder care facilities, you free up that highly educated cohort to enter the formal workforce.
It turns invisible labor into visible GDP-generating labor while simultaneously creating a whole new sector of paid care jobs. It patches the leaky pipeline.
And finally, recommendation number three, green transition. The goal is to decouple economic growth from carbon emissions before that 2.73-ton carbon footprint spirals completely out of control.
And triggers catastrophic climate feedback loops.
Right. If Armenia wants to continue pushing its HDI into the very high category, if they want to reach Scandinavian levels of development,
they cannot do so by doubling or tripling their carbon output. It will run afoul of international climate agreements, it will damage their own local agriculture, and it will trigger massive public health crises.
Decoupling means investing heavily in renewable energy and sustainable infrastructure now, while the economy is still malleable and growing.
Rather than trying to retrofit a massive, dirty industrial base decades later, like the US or China are struggling to do now.
It's a daunting roadmap. It requires dismantling deeply ingrained cultural norms and rewiring the energy grid simultaneously.
But honestly, looking at the data we just went through, I think they have the resilience to tackle it.
I mean, look at what they did to multidimensional poverty. They wiped it out entirely. Look at what they did to maternal mortality. They halved it. Look at what they did in Parliament. They multiplied female representation by 6.
The capacity for rapid, systemic, structural change is absolutely there in the data. They just need to aim that capacity at the economy and the environment.
And that brings us to the end of our journey through this incredible data set. We've seen how data isn't just numbers in a spreadsheet or lines on a graph.
It is the very real, very human story of a society unfolding in real time.
We've seen a country that flawlessly fixed its foundation, but now has to completely redesign its penthouse to fit everyone who deserves to be there.
But before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final, lingering thought. A blind spot in the data that we haven't fully addressed yet.
Oh, I love a good curveball. What is it?
We have spent this entire deep dive focused on the folded truth of female development.
Right.
We've focused entirely on how women can break into the economic sphere that men currently dominate, getting their income to match their towering education.
Lifting the ceiling, yeah.
But look at the other side of the ledger. Look at the men.
What about them?
Look at the significantly lower male life expectancy. Look at that staggering 14-year survival gap that opened up in 2020.
Oh, yeah.
Look at the stalling male education metrics, where men are expecting nearly a full year less of schooling than their female peers.
Wait, you're right?
While we absolutely must work to pull women up in the workplace to reflect their human capital, we have to ask, what systemic blind spots are causing men to fall so far behind in the classroom and the clinic?
That is a profound question.
Are there massive occupational hazards we are ignoring? Are there cultural pressures around traditional masculinity that prevent men from seeking health care until it's too late?
Is the pressure to be the sole breadwinner forcing young men out of the university and into the labor market prematurely, stunting their long-term human capital?
That is an incredibly powerful point. It completely flips the lens.
We spend so much time looking at the glass ceiling the women are hitting, we forget to look down and check if the floor is caving in underneath the men.
Because a truly equitable society, a society that maximizes human flourishing, cannot afford to leave anyone behind, regardless of gender.
There is always another layer to the data, isn't there?
Oh.
I want to thank you, the listener, for joining us on this deep dive. Next time you look at your own local data or you see a headline about a global ranking, I want you to remember the folded truths.
Remember to ask, who is in the penthouse, who is holding up the foundation, and who might be quietly falling behind.
Because sometimes the most fascinating, complex story in the world starts with nothing more than a simple ranking. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.